Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Ethics, Politics, and Economics major, we're so pleased to have all of you here for the Litowitz lecture. And before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I just want to tell you a little bit about what this Litowitz lectureship is. Robert H. Litowitz was began his training as a scholar, as a lawyer. He was at Columbia Law School, and he had a kind of change of heart and decided that what he was really interested in was ethics and the importance of ethics in social policy. So he came to the Yale Divinity School, and tragically, while he was at the Yale Divinity School, he was diagnosed with cancer. And upon hearing this, he set aside a trust, and in fact, devoted his remaining effort to building this trust that would then become the endowment for the Litowitz lectureship on ethics and social policy. So we're so pleased to have his legacy so meaningfully borne out by this lectureship that brings to life real life concerns about ethics in the world today. We're also honored to have with us his sister, Lori Litowitz, who is an established international artist and who comes all the way to us from Mexico. So maybe we could just... So I'm also delighted, of course, to introduce to you our speaker, this year's Litowitz lecturer, Ben Weisner, a graduate of Harvard College and the NYU School of Law. He now directs the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. So these are impressive credentials, but a lot of you, of course, are here because since July 2013, Ben Weisner has been the lead lawyer for Edward, thank you, Edward Snowden. And he's been leading this project of thinking about what it means to have free speech and national security so tightly intertwined in American politics. So there's no one better to help us think about the ethical, legal, and political complexities of cybersecurity. But he has one other claim to fame, which is that he is the son of Steve and Rachel Weisner, who are also here with us today. And Steve Weisner is the William O. Douglas Clinical Professor Emeritus of Law at the Yale Law School. And Rachel Weisner, among other things, was a dean of which college? Pearson College. And both of them have led exemplary careers of helping the vulnerable and being upright and just the best kind of citizen of the world. So I have to think that maybe they were some of the inspiration for your very public service-oriented career. So Ben Weisner is speaking to us today about the peculiar politics of national security. Welcome.
Thanks for that introduction, Fran. This is the wrong day for me to be speaking without a microphone because I picked up a bug that travels around offices. So if you can't hear me in the back, please wave and I'll try to project a little bit more. It's an honor to be included among the distinguished people who have given this lecture before me. Of course, I did a little bit of research to see who they were, and I'm really grateful to be here. You're looking at a photograph of the very first Air Force One. This was Harry Truman's presidential plane. And it was on this plane in 1947 that Truman signed the National Security Act, one of the founding documents of the security state. Now, as it happens, this particular plane was nicknamed the Sacred Cow, which could hardly be more appropriate. The common definition of sacred cow is something that has been accepted or respected for a long time and that people are afraid or unwilling to question. This seems to me quite an apt description of what we've come to call national security. My remarks today will be something of a provocation. I began my career as an ACLU lawyer just 5 weeks before the 9/11 attacks. And I've spent the decade and a half since then trying to bring constitutional principles into a space increasingly defined by constitutional exception. In my own very particular experience, the word national security has looked a lot like a bubble in at least two senses of that word. It's been isolated from opposing worldviews or even opposing facts, and it has experienced a rapid growth that is wildly out of proportion from its underlying reason for being. So before I go further down this line, let me clarify what I don't mean by national security. I'm not referring to national defense, which we might define as a nation's use of military power and intelligence assets to maintain its survival. And I'm not referring to public safety, which we might define as the use of police powers to protect the public from crime or other non-existential or non-territorial dangers. I'm referring to something more nebulous and elusive, a kind of civic religion that has arisen in the decades since Truman signed the National Security Act, and that has enshrined itself as the nation's paramount and defining interest. This religion has its own priesthood in the high offices of the defense and intelligence communities, its clergy members in the halls of the Capitol. Thank you. And its deacons and altar boys spread around think tanks and academies. And the theology of national security is predicated on a series of core tenets, or articles of faith, if you will, that I'll argue are highly questionable and yet rarely questioned. These baseline assumptions are so commonly accepted that we've become desensitized to how truly extreme and anti-democratic they are. My hope today is to begin to remystify them. So I will explore some of those tenets of the national security priesthood and why I think they're so consequential. By allowing this category error to metastasize without clear boundaries, we diminish our democracy by fundamentally weakening critical oversight mechanisms. And in a time of genuine constitutional crisis, such as the one that we may be experiencing now, they leave us with fewer tools of resistance at precisely the moment when those tools are most needed. So what are these core tenets of the national security priesthood? The first and most important is this: we live in uniquely dangerous times. Sometimes it's put another way. We face an unprecedented threat. And despite words like unique and unprecedented, this tenet appears to be evergreen. It's exemplified by Senator Lindsey Graham's remarkable but also typical statement in May of 2015. We have never seen more threats against our nation and its citizens than we do today. So let's paraphrase. The framers of the Constitution may have had certain ideas about the need to restrain government, but they never faced a threat like Al-Qaeda or ISIS or cyber attacks by state or non-state actors. We saw the same kind of thinking in Alberto Gonzalez's reprehensible dismissal of the Geneva Conventions as quaint and obsolete. These statements, to be charitable, are absurd. Relative to population, the casualty figures for the Revolutionary War were staggering compared to more recent conflicts. Indeed, that war represents the very definition of an existential national struggle. And the authors of the 1949 Geneva Conventions had just emerged from total war in which 50 million people, most of them civilians, had been killed. To call those people naive is the height of narcissism. So let's engage in a thought exercise. What would the framers of the Constitution or the drafters of the Geneva Conventions have made of a society in which at most 1 in 4 million people was likely to die in a terrorist attack, but the government nonetheless routinely frightened the public with color-coded terror alerts. Somehow I don't think they would have been impressed. Now, a corollary of this tenet is that today's terrorists are uniquely lethal supervillains. Normal prisons can't hold them, and of course, they can never be released. And so we heard the nation's top uniformed military officer warn us in 2002 that Guantanamo housed the worst of the worst. In his words, the sort of people who would chew through a hydraulics cable to bring down a C-17 transport plane. In New York City, we saw the deeply cynical protests by local elected officials who opposed holding the trial of the alleged 9/11 perpetrators in federal court in Manhattan on safety grounds. The result of that effort is that nearly 16 years after the 9/11 attacks, the trial of the alleged perpetrators has not even begun, something that should be a shame to everybody in this room. Now, it is important to qualify that this view of terrorists as supervillains who will kill us all is not shared by everybody in the security state. And you hear very different things in private conversations. In 2007 or 2008, I was invited to a dinner with a very senior military official, one who would go on to serve on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I said to him at that dinner, if you closed Guantanamo today and offered each detainee a weapon of his choice and dropped him off on the battlefield of his choice, they would collectively do less harm to this country than you're doing by keeping Guantanamo open. His response? A high five. But the fact that this person would never acknowledge that view in public is a consequence of the perverse, really upside-down politics of national security. Our prevailing political discourse rewards leaders who inflate the terrorist threat and marginalizes those who accurately contextualize it. So those who proclaim that today's terrorists represent an unprecedented threat to our way of life, that our existing laws, courts, and institutions, even our prisons, are inadequate in the face of this threat, that we have no choice but to dispense with core principles, including even the prohibition against torturing prisoners, to defeat this ruthless enemy, that in short, 9/11 changed everything, are extolled as hard-nosed realists, warriors who are willing to take the gloves off. By contrast, those who defend the vitality and viability of our constitutional system, who insist that our existing institutions are equal to the challenges posed by transnational terrorism, who demand that we abide by core principles, including fair trials for and humane treatment of prisoners, even if that means that terrorism suspects have to be released and political leaders have to be prosecuted, who in short do not believe that the threat of terrorism changed everything, are dismissed as weak and naive, afflicted by a pre-9/11 mindset. Now, I think this insistence on the language of war says less about the nature of our adversary and the nature of our conflict, and much more about the identity needs of our own would-be warriors. Here we see that former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld has named his solitaire app Play Churchill. Now leave aside for a moment that Rumsfeld's real-world attempt to play Churchill ended rather badly, and that the world is still suffering the consequences. And look who's playing Churchill now. Now, is it possible that Lindsey Graham is right and I'm wrong, and that terrorism is in fact the existential threat that he would have us believe it is, and that but for the wars and aggressive counterterrorism policies that people like me have criticized, we would have seen dozens of catastrophic terrorist attacks in these last 15 years? Sure, it's possible. As a noted solitaire app developer once said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This line of argument recalls the old joke. There's a man standing in the middle of Times Square with a sign that says, "Tigers, keep out." And a passerby asks him, "What's with the sign? There's no tigers in New York City." And the man nods knowingly. It's working. This is our difficulty. We cannot say what the world would look like if we didn't throw hundreds of billions of dollars at this problem. But if a lack of attacks is evidence that our strategy is working, and more attacks are evidence that we need even more counterterrorism resources, then we seem to have been trapped in a one-way ratchet. I would add that if our intelligence community were routinely thwarting deadly attacks, it would be in their nature to boast about it. Here you see former Attorney General John Ashcroft in Moscow in June of 2002, where he interrupted his visit to announce in a creepy video to the world that the US had captured one Jose Padilla, who was allegedly involved in a plot to detonate dirty bombs in major American cities. Now, even at that time, the evidence for that assertion was paper thin. We now know that it was much more fantasy than threat. And recall that government officials have made similarly breathless announcements about the thwarting of comically inept terrorist plots, many of them, of course, initiated by FBI informants. One of my favorites was the so-called Sears Tower plot, a nefarious attempt to knock down the iconic tower so that it would fall into Lake Michigan and create a tsunami. Vice President Dick Cheney described that one as a very real threat. The truth is, as the security expert Bruce Schneier has said, there aren't a lot of terrorists out there. America is full of big guns and soft targets. If it were also full of sleeper cells, we would know it by now. And this leads to an uncomfortable question. How have the leaders and defenders of the security state persuaded the citizens of the safest and most secure society in human history that the Huns are perennially at our doorstep? I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that question. But can there be any doubt that the ceaseless drumbeat of security state rhetoric about the seriousness of the terror threat created fertile ground for a presidential candidate to propose policies like a Muslim ban and a border wall, and to issue executive orders targeting the citizens of countries responsible for 0 American deaths in terrorist attacks? Moving on to the next tenet of the national security priesthood. Security is our paramount national interest. Now, this view is widely held and often stated. Even the Supreme Court of the United States, which should know better, has written that it is obvious and inarguable that the security of the nation is its preeminent interest. Is that so? It's certainly not clear that the framers of the Constitution would agree. Here's the preamble to the Constitution. As my friend, the journalist Bart Gellman, has observed, the preamble identifies not one, but the 6 basic purposes that we, the people, intend our government to advance. Fourth among them is to provide for the common defense. Union, justice, and tranquility precede that goal. Welfare and liberty follow. As Bart says, there's a tone of Catholicity here. We, the people, care a lot about the common defense, but defense has peers in our pantheon. It is now entirely common to refer to the president as commander-in-chief of the nation, not of the armed forces, a formulation that misperceives the president's constitutional role, even as it makes all of us soldiers as we sit at our computers tweeting and deleting emails. Now, a corollary of this tenet: if it makes us safer, it being a policy, we should do it. If it makes it safer, we should do it. All too often in the post-9/11 conversations about terrorism, it has seemed that the only question we should be asking is whether a proposed government action keeps us safe. We know from many other non-national security contexts that this framing is incomplete at best. We knowingly reject all manner of policies and regulations that would demonstrably make us safer. We know, for example, that we could reduce deaths from automobile accidents quite dramatically if we use sophisticated surveillance technologies to strictly enforce speed limits. We could require that every new car be fitted with a breathalyzer device that links to the ignition so that no car could be started by someone under the influence of alcohol. We could have sobriety checkpoints every few miles. Some of you may be nodding. I see you, Mom. And thinking that these are good ideas. Great. You can use the political process to advocate for policies like these. If and when they're proposed, others of you will say that the increases in road safety are not worth the cost and liberty of being issued automatic speeding violations by computers or of having TSA-level security on all of our roads and highways. The real question is, how much safer do we want to be? And how much are we willing to pay in rights and dollars for that increase in safety? We're already pretty safe from terrorists, and we should be wary of political rhetoric that leaves little room for other core constitutional values. Let's keep in mind that the authors of the Constitution and Bill of Rights would have been perplexed by a political discourse that subordinated hard-won rights to talismanic invocations of national security. Indeed, those documents were written to make the government's law enforcement and security functions more difficult, not easier. Just look at the Bill of Rights, the Fourth Amendment. The government can't search or seize without a warrant supported by probable cause of wrongdoing. The Fifth Amendment. The government can't force us to be witnesses against ourselves. The prosecutors don't get 2 bites at the apple. The government can't take away our freedom or our property without due process. The Sixth Amendment. We all get a lawyer. A public trial by jury. We can confront the evidence against us. The Eighth Amendment. They can't beat evidence out of us. And the only way to read those words written 200 years ago is to see that their authors were more worried about a government with too much power than about the bad guys who would inevitably get away. Now, a second corollary of this tenet allows the high priests of the security state to position themselves as the real defenders of civil liberties and human rights. And I often hear arguments like this one from government officials. If you think these policies are bad, just wait until there's another terrorist attack. The public is going to demand much worse. The implied takeaway is that we should gratefully allow the erosion of rights in order to prevent the erosion of still more rights. This formulation is an unhelpful straw man. It's a straw man because nobody is arguing that our police, military, and spies should unilaterally disarm. Virtually all of us support targeted counterterrorism measures that are proportional to the threat. And it's unhelpful because it tells us nothing about where difficult lines should be drawn. The third tenet: we should defer to the expertise of national security officials. Now, this anodyne-sounding principle has been at the heart of the security state's successful efforts to neuter constitutional oversight by the courts and Congress. And I think of all the tenets of the national security state, this one might have seemed the most alien to the Constitution's framers. The structure of our constitutional system is predicated on mistrust of aggregated authority. The very purpose of divided government and of constitutional protection for a free press was the framers' belief that leaders would use their power for improper purposes, not because they were evil, but because they were human. What the leaders of the security state called deference to their own expertise, the framers would have recognized as a structural conflict of interest. So, for example, when we at the ACLU sued CIA officials for their mistaken kidnapping and brutal treatment of our client, Khalid al-Masri, it was the CIA itself that invoked the state secrets privilege and successfully sought dismissal of the suit on grounds that litigation of our claims against them would harm national security. Let me put this another way. A torture victim's lawsuit was dismissed in deference to the expertise of an affidavit submitted by the perpetrators themselves. Secrecy doctrines like that one are the method most often used to enforce this principle of deference. Executive branch officials are literally indoctrinated, and this is their term, not mine, into the world of security clearance, which I prefer to call the deep state omerta. And the security clearance regime allows government officials to put forward the corollary of the deference rule. If you only knew what we knew, if you only saw what we saw, you would understand why we have to do what we do. When you hear that, be sure to keep in mind that the most grievous and damaging decisions affecting the national security have always been made by officials with access to the most closely guarded secrets. And here I want to tell you about a conversation I had with now former Israeli Supreme Court Justice Aharon Barak, who teaches here at the Yale Law School every fall. When I was litigating these state secrets cases against the CIA and others, I asked him, what would you do if you got a declaration, an affidavit from the head of the CIA saying that allowing this case to go forward would harm national security? Would you do what these American judges have done and dismissed it? And he said, I'll tell you what I did do. There was litigation about where a security wall should be, separating Israel from the occupied territories. And the army thought it should go here, and the human rights groups that were challenging it thought it should go here. And I said to the army, when they said, we're the experts in national security, I said, yes, you are. You are the experts in security, and I am the expert in proportionality. I am the one who is best able to consider the other competing values at stake, and so the wall goes here. Now that approach has allowed the Israeli High Court to issue important precedential decisions about torture, targeted killing, and other highly sensitive security issues, even as their US counterparts have dismissed all of those cases in deference to government claims of secrecy. Fourth, I'm going to take a short break. National security officials who break the law do so in good faith. Advocates who seek to hold them legally accountable do so in bad faith. This tenet holds that our national security officials are uniformly honorable public servants working under extreme pressure, while human rights advocates who second-guess their decisions are practicing lawfare, a kind of asymmetric warfare waged from the safety of our fifth column. The term lawfare itself has generally been defined as the strategy of using or misusing law as a substitute for traditional military means to achieve an operational objective. Now, remarkably, this is how the high priests of the deep state and their apologists tend to view any efforts to hold them accountable for grave violations of the Constitution. The Brookings Institution's Benjamin Wittes, who I don't need to single out, but will, editor-in-chief of the Lawfare blog. The Lawfare blog, if you're not familiar with it, operates as a kind of online clubhouse for the national security set, has defended the notorious Department of Justice torture memos, which purported to authorize interrogation techniques that the US had long considered criminal, as the good faith work of lawyers who were, in his words, addressing very hard questions under extraordinarily hard circumstances. But listen to how he describes a human rights organization that criticized the Obama administration for its political decision to look forward rather than backward, and to decline even to investigate the architects of the Bush administration's torture conspiracy. Wittes again. What Human Rights First calls accountability for torture is, in my book, the criminalization of policy differences. Nothing more or less. Nothing more or less. In 4 words, he breezily dismisses a deeply established body of domestic and international law, including treaties to which our country is signatory, and accuses human rights defenders of pursuing a partisan political vendetta, which is, of course, exactly backwards. It was the torturers and their apologists who were politicizing the law, not human rights advocates who were criminalizing politics. But this sense of outraged dignity at the notion that honorable public servants who were protecting the nation could have their actions second-guessed by naive idealists is a common trope of national security discourse. The result is that there is virtual impunity for any senior security state official who insists that his alleged misconduct was carried out under the banner of national security. And so, for example, every single lawsuit brought by a victim of the Bush administration's torture regime has been dismissed without any adjudication of either the law or the facts. This, of course, means that the perpetrators have escaped accountability and the victims have been deprived of any remedy. But equally important, our system of justice has been deprived of a definitive adjudication of the lawfulness of the alleged conduct. So should we be surprised when a new president feels free to relitigate this question? Can we even call it relitigation when we were never allowed to litigate it in the first place? So to sum up briefly, the ideology of national security has taught us that the world is always a very scary place and that Islamic terror is on par with earlier existential threats to our nation, that security should be our primary national concern, that courts and Congress should generally defer to the expertise of executive branch officials on national security questions, and that executive officials should be exempt from legal accountability because their activities, even their abuses, are always carried out in service of the nation. Now, it's more than a little bit ironic to me that the national security actors and cheerleaders who brought us this ideology, many of whom have now emerged as critics of President Donald Trump, seem to have very little sense that they've spent the last several decades helping to lay the groundwork for a fear-based presidency and advocating the weakening of constitutional constraints that were put in place precisely to protect us from a malignant actor like Trump. So, as discordant as it may be, I'm going to try to end on a note of optimism after all of that, if only so that I can show this slide. If nothing else, the events of the last weeks and months have made clear that national security politics are a game with serious consequences. What would it look like to have a different kind of national security politics? How might we envision a politics based more on courage than on fear, more on resilience than on reaction? And we have to ask, is fear of terrorism as deep-seated as our leaders seem to believe it is? Or is it a language that we've all grown accustomed to? I think there's reason to believe that the public might be grateful for a different kind of conversation about security and terrorism. I think we saw some of this sentiment in the tens of thousands of Americans who spontaneously flocked to airports to protest the Trump administration's ban on refugees and visitors from predominantly Muslim countries. I'm convinced that those demonstrations played a critical role in the decisions of the judges to enjoin the enforcement of Trump's orders. We like to think of our courts as insulated somehow from the political tides, but I think the opposite is true. A frightened public will contribute to judicial decisions upholding abusive security policies, and a courageous public will embolden judges to stand up for human rights and civil rights. A short anecdote. Some years ago, when those color-coded terror alerts were still the norm, I was watching CNN during one of those Department of Homeland Security announcements setting the threat level at orange, I believe. And after a few minutes of somber-sounding terrorism experts expounding on the latest terrorist chatter, CNN split the screen to show other breaking news. A dog floating on a piece of ice was being rescued by the Coast Guard. And after a few more minutes, the terror alert disappeared and the full screen was given over to the dog ice rescue. Now, after the last few months, we probably all feel a little bit like the dog on the ice, but the point that I'm trying to make is that this episode revealed how much our security discourse has operated as a kind of theater. I have the sense that the American people are ready for something more substantial. I believe the public would respond to a politics that places courage back at the center of citizenship. Let's remind our leaders, because they've failed to remind us, that in our national anthem, land of the free and home of the brave appear in the same clause And let's tell them that the only thing that truly frightens us is that our leaders might burn down the village in order to save it. That is, that in the name of defending the nation, they'll make it a place not worth defending. So thank you so much for listening, and I would be glad to answer questions and have a conversation for a while. Let's leave resilience on the screen.
Ben, why don't you field the questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So who wants to be first?
Would you comment on the security issue regarding our political figures and the president, where that fits in the things that you're talking about?
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean? Which
Well,
security
very
issue?
high, it seems to me there's more and more security, it's called, for them.
Oh, around them.
Correction, yes, around them, and the Attorney General and the EPA person, everybody's getting security. I'd just like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I haven't thought a lot about this one. I mean, certainly we've had, how many presidential assassinations have we had in this country? At least 2. Is it more than 2, Dennis? 3? 3 or 4. And then we've had candidates who are, so it's not exactly where I would plant my flag as a critique in saying that there's too much of a bubble around the president himself. What we have seen in this administration is that even the Secretary of Education and the EPA administrator have demanded much more security than others have. But again, I don't know whether that's a reflection of increased threats because of increased political polarization. There is something regrettable, about a world where there's such a gap between a security bubble that they move in and the rest of us. But I'm more concerned about the conversational bubble, that people in government don't think that anybody who lacks a security clearance could have anything important to say about policy. I'm more worried about them being trapped in that bubble than I am about too much Secret Service. Danny.
A lot of the rhetoric about you should trust us is coupled with assertions that we have actually aborted several serious attempts to do bad things. Now, do you know of any data at all about just anything about what they...
So again, the assertion that but for such and such counterterrorism policies, there would have been this number of attacks, is one that can't be disproven. It's like any conspiracy theory. It's set up so that there's no fact that could be brought in that would disprove it. But there are some facts that are useful. So one that I'm familiar with, the first program that was revealed in the Snowden revelations was a program in which the NSA on a daily basis was collecting the metadata of all phone calls from all the major phone companies and turning them over, storing them for 5 years, right? And so when this program was revealed, the NSA came forward and said that the program had been critical to stopping 54 terrorist plots, which seemed like an alarming number. Under scrutiny, including from members of Congress who had security clearance and who had been briefed on this, that number kept going down until it was 1. The New Yorker wrote a whole article about that 1. And that 1 was a Somali-American cab driver who had sent $8,000 back to Mogadishu to someone who might have been connected to the Shabab. Right? So what you saw there was the progression from national security officials coming out to the podium and saying this stopped 54 terrorist attacks, to the quiet story in a more fringe publication that a few people read that said actually it was only 1 and even that one was bullshit. So again, we know that, as I said before, it's in their nature to boast about their successes. If the vice president is saying that the Sears Tower plot is a very real threat that they managed to wrap up, then they don't have a lot of things that they can brag about. Again, it's from the outside looking in, it's impossible for me to say with evidence that their claims are lies, but I believe that with all my heart. Yeah. Yes?
You spoke about the rhetoric being used by national security of being at an unprecedented level of danger. Now, but also while talking about civil liberties, how it seems like the rhetoric around it is that our liberties are also at an unprecedented level of danger. And that seems to be something like, before, whether now it's unprecedented, before, during the McCarthy era and what was going on, and before with FDR trying to pack the courts and Lincoln in suspending habeas corpus. Is it just, are civil liberties just perpetually in, this kind of crisis of, being taken away? Was there a time when they were not?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The way that a civil libertarian would answer that is that none of this is an inheritance. All of this is contested. None of these victories are things that we can take for granted. The terrain is going to have to be fought over constantly. But that doesn't mean that there aren't enormous spikes. Traditionally, those have happened in wartime. And there's a very interesting article written by the late Justice Brennan about civil liberties in wartime that he delivered as a lecture at Hebrew University, where he said basically we have this tradition in this country of suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, interning the Japanese Americans during World War II, Cold War, McCarthyism, but that we come to our senses. So there's a sort of elasticity. We realized that we went too far and we came back. I think the reason why people like me have been so concerned about the post-9/11 environment is not because what's happened is worse than the Japanese internment. Of course it isn't. But because in those earlier wars, looking back at them, the people who were in the middle of them didn't know when they were going to end, but they more or less knew how they were going to end, right? World War II was going to end with someone surrendering somewhere. But what happens when you define a war the way that we define war now? What will the end look like? So are we enshrining a permanent state of exception, and are we out of that cyclical model where things got worse and then they got better? So that's the real concern. And then I think the other part of it is that with habeas corpus, with the internment, usually there came a time when the legal system stepped in after the fact and too late to vindicate the core rights at issue. So the Supreme Court said in 1866 that Lincoln was wrong to suspend habeas corpus. Thanks. But maybe that was the right way of dealing with it. Don't try to tie the president's hands down in an existential civil war, but vindicate the principle afterwards. The problem is we haven't seen the principles vindicated here. So that because of these justiciability doctrines like secrecy and standing and so, we haven't had courts come in and say, you know what? What you did to these prisoners in cages by beating them, some of them to death, was illegal. There's no decision holding that anything that the Bush administration did to detainees was illegal. Every one of those cases was thrown out. So that's another concern about it. But I do take your point that there can be outrage fatigue and that we should watch our rhetoric. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the securitization of domestic security? So I'm thinking sort of the militarization and, for lack of a better term, the intelligencization of policing and how we can sort of defend civil liberties on the local level when it seems like it's becoming so enmeshed with the national security.
Well, what you see is the migration of both security technology and security policy from military intelligence and war zones back into local communities. So obviously the images of armored police vehicles going through cities are the most dramatic and the ones that show that the most, or SWAT teams on a marijuana raid with 16 armed officers with machine guns shooting people's dogs as they go in, right? But it happens a lot with surveillance technologies too, things that are developed for use in war zones, finding their way back home. You could understand why in a war zone you might want to have a drone flying overhead 24 hours with a sophisticated camera so that even if you can't stop the IED from blowing up your troop carrier, you can hit rewind on the tape, see what village the person came from, follow the person back. But do we really want to use that same technology to solve every liquor store robbery? And so a lot of these surplus technologies get pushed out to terrorism task forces or drug task forces in the communities without really any local input. So a lot of this stuff goes through federal government grants that circumvent local political processes. So one of the things that we've been doing is trying to push city councils, the ultimate local government, to pass ordinances saying that these cities will not accept even free military or surveillance technology from the federal government without some kind of local input, some kind of debate about what they're going to be used for, and some vote on whether they're going to accept it. And we've gotten a couple dozen cities to take this up now, and so I do think that, especially now where you have sort of one-party rule in Washington and people are feeling pretty powerless about what they can do, this is an effort where, the Oakland City Council, it must feel irrelevant in blue California, right? But it's not. You can start modeling policies at the local level that will push out across the country. Yes?
I have a question about the first myth of the security state being the unprecedented nature of the threat. So you talked about the fact that in terms of magnitude, terrorism is not that significant. Conventional wars preceding it killed many more people. But I am wondering whether the nature of the threat, whether you would say that it has changed in terms of the tactics of the perpetrators, because it does seem that has changed substantially with terrorist organizations employing covert measures, blending into civilian populations, things like that, and whether that requires a different type of response.
Yeah, I guess, the first thing I would say is changed since when? We had bombs blowing up the Attorney General's house in 1917. There was more terrorism in the US in the 1970s than there was in the decade after 9/11 in terms of people killed, in terms of radical organizations, sort of blowing people up, hijacking planes. You might say that certain capabilities now are so enhanced that it justifies a much different kind of response. And so, the ultimate bogeyman that we heard was nuclear experts and that wing of the security state. And you can go back and find these quotes from 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, and they all say, we predict that there's a 50% chance that someone will blow up a dirty bomb in an American city in the next 6 years. Of course, no one ever goes back to look at those, but everyone makes the prediction. Now, my view is that nuclear proliferation is a threat that's outside the model that I've been talking about today. That's an existential threat. And it justifies nuclear proliferation. We should be much, much more serious about that internationally and making sure that those kinds of materials are locked down. But in terms of terrorism, the real question is, how should we treat it? Does it make sense to spend, $80 billion a year on a military response to something that, even if it looks different, is probably better handled as a gumshoe law enforcement issue? And one part of this that I didn't get at is the way that our treatment of the terrorists vindicates their view of themselves. So they see themselves as warriors. They see themselves as engaged in a civilizational war against us. We shouldn't aggrandize them that way. We should call them the criminals and murderers that they are, and we should punish them. Again, it is an amazing thing that there's been no 9/11 trial. Why has there not been a trial? Because we decided to treat this as this wildly exceptional thing, and because we tortured those people so badly that now it's very complicated to even bring them to justice. But no, I guess my general view is that, for the most part, terrorism looks a lot like it always has, and that, we don't compare it. We don't think enough about how rates of terrorism have been fairly steady over time in free societies. Yes.
What do you think everyday citizens can kind of best do to promote engagement with these ideas? What can each of us be doing to really get people to be combating the kind of apathy and misinformation surrounding these topics?
Yeah, it's a hard question, and And nothing that I'm talking about is something that you can do a whole lot about on an individual level, right? But I, you know, when you hear somebody say, you know, I don't care if they know everything that's on my cell phone because I didn't do anything wrong and they're protecting me from terrorism. We tend to focus on the part of it of, you know, whether you've done something wrong. We don't tend to think enough about the predicate for the question. You know, what is this scary threat that justifies their looking at private information on your cell phone, right? I mean, so I do think, you know, collectively,
They heard that.
yes, collectively we can promote the idea of courage and resilience in the face of a terrorist threat. So one not nice thought, but one that we need to have now is, how is President Trump going to respond to the first substantial terrorist attack in the United States? It's coming. It won't be 9/11 necessarily, but it might be on the level of the Bataclan attack in Paris, which killed 100 people, or San Bernardino, which killed 16, or Orlando, 49. And how are we going to respond to it? You know, I think they're expecting us to respond like sheep, and to fall in line and say, now we realize you were right, and we need your protection so that you can protect us from this 1 in 4 million event. So how can we respond differently? You know, in Paris, there were millions of people in the street after those attacks. You know, it didn't stop their government from passing bad laws, but I think there was this sense of solidarity. Like, let's not do what, you know, it's hard after the fact to criticize Boston, but I think it was a disaster that they locked down a major American city for a day and a half to chase a couple of people. I don't think that's the way that we should respond. I think that makes, again, it makes terrorists who they think they are. So, you know, who are you going to be? Where are you going to be? What are you going to be doing the day after the first terrorist attack here in the Trump administration? That's something to think about. Yes?
So I want to kind of push back a little bit on
Finally.
on your supposition that it's in the intelligence agency's best interest to advertise countering attacks and preventing them. I think it probably is in their net interest to do so, but there are certainly, I can imagine negatives of doing so.
Yeah.
First, that it could come up, like, give terrorists ideas. This is something that we've stopped once, but it's not necessarily something that we could always stop and be sure to do so. It could encourage terrorists by saying, you're right, look, here are 50 attacks, or here are 10 attacks. It's an example of how many other people hate the United States. It could also scare the public, which would upset politicians. And I know that, I think there is a tenuous balance between wanting to scare the public, but not wanting to freak them out too much. And I also think that the intelligence communities are encouraged to be discreet by nature of what they do. And lastly, one big difference between using the technology for speeding or for monitoring our cell phones is that, or I guess the better example would be putting a breathalyzer in our car, is that that's something we would see and feel, whereas our telephones, we're not aware. We know it, but we don't feel it on a daily basis. And if we're made aware of these things and everything that the agencies are doing, that could create more opposition to it.
So I think everything that you just said is logical and rational. I just think it's wrong. I mean, no, I do. I just think it's empirically wrong. I wasn't arguing about what's in the interests of intelligence officials in terms of disclosure, but rather what's in their nature. Well, and maybe those aren't totally two separate things. But think about, you're a senior official in a gargantuan bureaucracy that has justified itself for half a century because of a Cold War that is a genuine existential threat. And how do you, when that Cold War ends, sort of justify the massive authorities and budgets that are flowing toward, and, in the 1990s when people were writing books called The End of History and how are we going to spend the peace dividend, this is when terrorism emerged as all of a sudden not the way that we had treated it in the US before, which was this radical nuisance, something that was not an existential threat but not something we could eradicate, but something on the level of the Cold War. And so, yes, look, I think that they are always looking for ways to advertise their successes and to justify the enormous authority and the enormous money that we give them. Again, the actual truth involves, there's not one person directing this conspiracy. There's millions of people who hold security clearances, and most of them are indeed honorable public servants who are, doing important work for the country. I just think that it's wildly out of proportion to what the country needs right now, and that in a lot of instances, involving wars of choice and invasions and things like that, it creates far more problems than it solves. But look, there's no question that there have been times when our intelligence agencies have had successes that they have not broadcast until much later because they didn't want to show the sources and methods that they used in order to get that intelligence. No question. Things like that happen all the time. I don't want to say categorically that never happens. It's just that with terrorism, it would be shocking to me if when the papers from this era get declassified in 75 years, we find out that in fact, Cheney and Bush and Rumsfeld and these others, stopped massive terrorist attacks and didn't tell us about it. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the question of existential risk being outside of this model that you're advocating. But I think in reality, they're actually extremely entangled with these terrorism questions in terms of how we handle, proliferation, but maybe even more so bioterrorism risk and how that's very deeply integrated into like what DHS does.
Yeah.
So how do you?
Well, let me ask you, why do you think there hasn't been a bioterror attack? I mean, so there was.
Feasibility issues.
But well, I mean, so in Tokyo, when did Om Shiraku use sarin gas in the subways? When was that? In the early 90s? Yeah. I mean, again, I don't think terrorism is that hard. That kind of terrorism. I mean, we probably will get to a world where the capability of like a kid in a basement lab to inflict huge damage on lots of people is something genuinely scary. It doesn't follow that giving $80 billion to the military, to deal with that problem is better than having the police try to do it. But I might have cut off part of your question.
Yeah, I would just say, sarin, that's a chemical attack. That's not
Yeah.
the same type of existential threat.
Right.
And on the biowarfare question, that is a possibility. And the question is, how do we move that money from the military to science stuff that can actually deal with that more effectively? And how do you they are entangled now, whether they're right or wrong. How does that process happen?
I don't know. There are people who are, sort of teaching classes in different kinds of schools now about, the future of, terrible weapons. There are books written about this now, and I don't really have an answer to it. If you spend too much time thinking about it, it will keep you up at night. Right? In 1980. Everyone was worried about people having the recipe for making an atomic bomb, and there were lawsuits about whether magazines could actually publish the secrets. And it turned out, having the information wasn't enough. There were both problems of getting the materials and the fact that there are not that many people who really want to blow up an atomic or nuclear bomb, right? Most of the terrorist organizations are, you need to think about them as political. It doesn't help to say, they're crazy people who hate our freedom. It helps to situate them in the political context in which they see themselves. It's not in the interest of most of those groups to detonate a nuclear or atomic weapon, probably, right? But still, we're going to get to a time, I think the bigger problem is not going to be, a terrorist organization. It's going to be a genius PhD in a lab, with a mental health issue. Right, and I'm not sure I see that as a question of national security in the way that I'm talking about it, but it's certainly a problem. Yeah.
Sorry to push back on the optimistic part of it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on what you see as this new potential politics emerging, how it might emerge. Because I have trouble seeing how that might come about? Do you see it as sort of the median American voter actually changing their views and conditioning their voting on these types of issues? Do you see this as a smaller but committed group that takes targeted action on these types of policy concerns? What gives you, what are the specific things that you see that make you think that there's some possibility?
Well, I mean, you know, for one thing, resilience is a term that you actually hear in military circles. And then, you know, if you saw the response in the UK to the recent terror attack near the Parliament, right, there's a whole practice now that, you know, sort of law enforcement have. We can't prevent these kinds of things, but how can we instantly move to minimize the harm? How can we have our first responders closer? How can we, you know, shorten the gap of time between injury and medical interventions and all those kinds of things? So I do think that there's a sense that, you know, this conversation needs to happen. You know, I think one of the silver linings of this presidency is that, you know, it will, you know, Trump is not going to get the same response to saying terrorists are scary that Obama got, or even that Bush got, or Cheney got. You know, people so distrust him in their guts that it's actually going to create some of that space, I think. Again, you know, seeing those spontaneous protests to a national security policy that was discriminatory, that was something really remarkable. But I don't have a political program. You know, I mean, I'm at one side of this. You know, more involved in the litigation side of it. It's more that I want to provoke this conversation so that people are thinking about it. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned Israel earlier, and you talked about how you thought that the Israeli courts have done a better job of drawing a line and determining for themselves. I'm curious as to whether you see that other countries are doing a better job reacting to this new atmosphere of terrorism, and why you think that might be, why we think that.
Yeah, and I guess to be clear, I wasn't even commenting on how the Israeli High Court was deciding these issues. I was commenting on the fact that they were deciding them. Right, so that here our national security discourse has actually taken judges out of the process. All of the national security judicial doctrines are about, you know, deference. We have a doctrine called, you know, political question. When we tried to establish boundaries for when the U.S. could fire drones, the government said it was a political question, and the court agreed. That's a political question, meaning it's a question for the president and for Congress, not for the courts. Meanwhile, you had the Israeli Supreme Court grappling with that question. You know, what are the 4 conditions that have to be met before the government can do a targeted assassination, right? And again, I'm not here to agree with the outcome, but just to say there are other legal cultures, including those that have very direct and probably more direct experience of terrorism than ours, including Israel and many European countries. You know, apart from 9/11, that, you know, where their courts weigh in. And so, you know, all the torture victims that I represented, you know, many of them had, you know, some tie to some other country. They got nothing from the U.S. They didn't get a day in court. Many of them got compensated by European governments for very minor roles in these ordeals, right? So those court systems were actually willing to kind of hear these cases, and even if they weren't going to say, you know, this leader is going to be held accountable in this way, they at least knew that the victim needed to be compensated for what had gone on. So, but I'm not a comparative scholar, so, you know, I can't say, you know, these 3 countries do the best. Yes?
Can I ask an Edward Snowden question?
Yes, sure.
So,
You know, if this talk had been 6 months ago, the first question would have been an Edward Snowden question. Yeah, yeah.
so when Trump was elected, all this stuff about how his campaign might have coordinated with the Russians and how he loved Putin came out, it all looked as though maybe Snowden's ability to stay in the Soviet Union and not be repatriated here to be tried in prison and God knows what we're going to do might have happened. I think things are kind of back to where they used to be. But at that time, were you afraid there might have been a swap for something?
I've never thought it was likely. It's always something I worry about. But I never thought it was likely. At just the time that everyone everyone now apparently is a Russia scholar in the U.S. If you follow my social media accounts, yeah. Everyone seems to know everything about what's going on in Russia. Of course he's going to be sent back, and that same week, the Russian government, in an administrative process, extended his legal residency there until April of 2020. Now that doesn't mean that he can't be sent back at any time. What makes me most uneasy is how often and how loudly he criticizes the Russian government over their censorship and surveillance practices. Right now, the two places he can be are in Russia or in U.S. prison. But that hasn't quieted him. I mean, he has criticized their surveillance laws and called them their Big Brother internet law. He was speaking out about their street protests against the corruption a few weeks ago. I mean, his view is he would rather not be there, but he won't be there at the cost of silencing himself. As he said to me, I didn't do this to make friends. If it means that I get sent back, I get sent back. It would be uncommon. But then again, everything about this case is uncommon. The trades that you hear about are ordinarily when we catch their spies and they catch ours, hold on to them for a while and swap them. This is actually something quite different than that, right? And of course, if you're Russia, you want 10 more Edward Snowdens. I mean, you probably want them to be people who don't criticize you and maybe actually cooperate. But still, you want an environment where people will walk in. You don't want them to think they'll be traded back. In the same way that we would never send back to Russia or China someone in a similar circumstance. We would never do it, I think. I could be wrong. It could happen tomorrow. One more? Yeah.
I was curious about what you said about Boston, about how you thought that the city should have just kept on operating as normal. Because, I mean, imagine if we're back, Boston bombing has just happened. There's people on the loose. We don't know if they have more bombs that could then be going off in the subway, in streets.
It's
we
true.
have no idea. Imagine then if we, business as usual, keep on going, and then a day later, these bombs are set off in the metro.
You're right. It's hard, and I don't know what I would do if I were the Boston police chief or the governor of Massachusetts or the mayor of Boston. I'm just saying that the result was terrible. The look was awful. I mean, you basically told every 19-year-old bozo, here's how you shut down a major American city. And that's a very bad look. Like, that's terrorism succeeding. And so, again, I really said that with some trepidation. It's hard to criticize the calls people make in the moment. I don't know what they knew about who had done what, but there's a lot of situations where we have manhunts in this, in this country where we don't shut down cities. Even when we know that there are people on the loose with powerful weapons, we tell people to keep a lookout. We do Amber Alerts. We do, we do news reporting, but we don't tell everybody to barricade themselves in their homes. So, yeah, I mean, it's obviously a hard situation because if you are a political leader, you get blamed for the death, right? And so you end up taking these decisions because they're the risk-averse decisions to make. But that I come back to courage, right? Do we want to live in a city? Do we want to live in a country where cities are locked down in that situation every time? Brussels was locked down for a couple of days last year. It was terrible. What a note to end on. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Actually, I'm not taking us off this point.
Yeah.
You mentioned that perhaps sort of a gumshoe operation, local police, cities, would be the more appropriate place to deal with finding out who's doing what.
Almost always.
But a lot of our local police have not such a great relationship with minority communities either, and so it seems like there's still some work to do in maybe local politics more generally, oversight of police and building a more community-based policing system. I don't know if you've thought about that or have views about that.
A lot. The NYPD, which is the behemoth, has both. So they have more counterterrorism officers than the FBI. The New York Police Department does, right? They have 1,000 people who are working on that alone. And after 9/11, they were as bad as any secret police force. They were infiltrating student groups. They were in mosques. They were in restaurants. They were really sowing distrust in the community. But they also are models of community policing in other ways. But yeah, I mean, I think
Same people or different units?
no, different. But yes, within the same force. And they've actually now they're under consent decrees that limit the ways in which they can intrude into those communities and bring them back to a more balanced approach. But yes, I mean, your point overall about policing almost introduces a whole new difficult topic to this conversation, which is now that we've agreed that it should be the police and not the military, how should the police do it?
Because I could imagine they're getting very excited about big budgets too, and you could, without
Right.
really careful oversight.
In the 80s, the way that local police departments got fancy equipment was by being on narcotics task forces and working with the DEA. And since 9/11, the way that they get big budgets is by being on joint terrorism task forces and infusion centers. And you have these state police people doing trainings for state police in upstate New York on the 7 signs of terrorism, right? I mean, ridiculous things. That I mean, if you see some of the brochures that these entities put out, it's unbelievable. I mean, you would think that there were terrorist attacks in the country every day. So that is a problem. Yeah.
Does somebody have a happy?
No, it's not. It's my fault for setting the tone.
I have a
Yeah.
small question. It's legal, slightly legal. So, can you speak legally about the one of the examples that you started out with? You gave an example of civil liberty and driving. I don't understand technically the difference between why you place in the same group a breathalyzer in the car and checkpoints. Because a breathalyzer in a car seems to me similar more to better brakes. Better brakes help the driver prevent an accident and help whoever may hit not get hit. A breathalyzer to me would seem similar to that. I can clearly see how checkpoints are violations of civil liberty, but I don't see why you placed those two in the same group.
Well, I guess the world that I was contemplating is one in which every single car, in order for you to be able to drive the car, it has to be fitted with that breathalyzer. Now, I actually wasn't raising it as a legal issue. I was raising it as a policy issue. Would we favor that? Do we want to live in a world where a car doesn't start until sober breath is blown into it? I wasn't actually raising that as a Fourth Amendment question at all. I was raising that as a question of, is that an intrusion into our personal liberty?
That's what I don't understand.
Why isn't it?
Why isn't it more like a better brake?
Well, I mean, I think there are many people in this room who have driven home after a couple of beers. Maybe they shouldn't. Probably they shouldn't. I have, right? A lot of us have in some kind of circumstance. And, I would rather, live in a world where people work out and manage that kind of risk than one in which...
Presumably, it would be, considering how sophisticated cars are today, it would be able to distinguish, it would not be set off by 100 beers, it would be set off by 10 beers.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. You could set it to that, right? I think you thought I was making a legal point, and I wasn't. I was just giving examples of already existing technology that could save lives on the highway that many people would oppose. And I assure you that there would be outrage, particularly in Western libertarian parts of this country, to a government mandate that you can't start your car without blowing sober breath into it. There would be huge... Now, that might not be your issue at all. You may think that's a really easy one. Great.
I don't understand, actually, why that would be considered a violation of civil liberty. That's what I don't understand legally.
Okay.
I clearly understand the checkpoint, I don't understand.
Yeah, and civil liberty isn't a legal issue necessarily.
I might agree with it, but I don't understand.
Okay. Yeah, I mean...
Once it's explained, I don't understand
Yeah.
how it's...
I think we'll have to end it on that. I mean, what?
Work
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there are, people who don't think it's a civil liberties issue at all to go through a body scanner at an airport. They think it's the most trivial thing in the world to have one of these scanning devices shoot backscatters at you and draw a picture of what might be in your pockets. Then it's just the farthest thing from the issue at all. But if you go back to the 1960s, the ACLU was opposed to any kind of X-rays in airports at all, right? I mean, that's not our position anymore. But people's views on these kinds of things evolve. So, yeah, we can do one more. Okay.
So I'm wondering if it's possible for citizens to exhibit the kind of courage you're discussing, even while the state may not. So, for instance, you mentioned the Bataclan attacks, and you said that the people came out in solidarity, but simultaneously France declared a state of emergency. Suspended the Schengen privileges and all of that for quite a while. And so, how do you kind of square that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. I mean, I don't have an answer to it. I generally think that on these issues, my intuition is that there's a hunger for leaders to behave in the way that the public did in that case. That could be wrong. The risk-free thing for political leaders to do is to, say this is an existential threat and to accumulate more power. Maybe the riskier thing would be to say, we're France, and that's who we are, and we're not going to change a thing. And I really do think that if the president had said that on that day, the people in the streets would have been able to turn that into pride, turn that in, rather than fear. So maybe the people have to lead.
Ben, could you just say one more time the last line of your talk? I thought that was actually pretty striking. The idea, we have this idea that our courts are going to do what they're going to do, and there's political independence of the courts. So if you could just say that one more time.
Well, the last line was the land of the free and home of the brave. But I do think that what
well, the one before that.
Well, what I meant was that if you see these legal decisions that are constraining Trump, and your conclusion is the system is working and we can relax right now, you're misreading the moment. That it's the people who lead and the courts who follow in these cases. And that, if you were trying to litigate against security policies in the years after 9/11, the atmosphere was one of absolute complete deference to the government at that time. But I really do think that, in the first weekend of the Trump refugee ban, 4 judges issued injunctions blocking it. All 4 who heard it. That would not have occurred if there hadn't been tens of thousands of people, not just in San Francisco and at JFK, but in Louisville and in Dallas, and spontaneously places where, foreign flights don't even land. People were going to airports. That became the place of resistance. And so if you were in the streets for the Women's March or the tax march or went to an airport, stay in the streets. It's going to make a big difference. Yeah.
Just to your question, I think with better brakes, you can still get home. With a breathalyzer, you're stuck in your friend's driveway. And also, your better brakes don't keep a record of how many times you've been drunk in the past year.
Agreed, but it's wrong. When you go through a screening in the airport, the reason for that is because of all the people you would affect that are on the plane as well, and whatever you might be carrying. Even in a car, the limit is simply yourself and whoever you're responsible for. And so in that sense, I think it's much closer to a better break. I don't see the comparison at all to a screening in an airport. It's a very different situation.
I actually had a question. So about the rhetoric that you talked about and how they're framing themselves as warriors, I'm just wondering if that's not something that's been happening since, obviously Churchill, but then before that,
Churchill was.
Glory. How do we
they were warriors.
Heroes?
That's the thing. I think what's going on is that, these people the Lindsey Grahams of the world, want to believe, they need to believe that they're part of a great struggle. They need to think that they're part of the same kind of struggle that their fathers and grandfathers were part of when there were world wars going on. And that's why I say it's an identity need. So, the problem is that it's so vastly out of proportion with the reality of the threats that they're talking about. And it leads us into, really terrible places. So, these senators insist on treating terrorism detention as a military issue. And so you end up with a Guantanamo. And you end up with, hundreds of people being detained without charge or trial, because that's the way we do it in war. In war, you don't have to do trials. You get to hold people till the end of hostilities. And so now we have hundreds of people who, might be innocent or who could be prosecuted, who are instead sitting in these prisons. It means that, you can target drone strikes far away from anything that we would consider a battlefield in our traditional language of war. And we're just escalating the, sort of global violence in service of this rhetoric. So yes, I think there is a lot of continuity. The warrior language isn't new. It's just so inappropriate for the context right now in ways that I think that are dangerous.
So are we able to still honor people that we do consider war heroes,
Of course.
while at the same time dismissing perhaps people who are giving commands or shaping the landscape in a lot of ways?
Yes, definitely. Although I would recommend a recent book by Rosa Ehrenreich, who served in the Defense Department for many years, about how we actually over-valorize the military in this country to our detriment. That we worship the military in ways that are harmful to democracy and that harmful to the military as well. Yes, the point is not to say that we shouldn't, honor veterans who actually served in war zones. The point is that we shouldn't define every part of the, our counterterrorism efforts as part of a great military struggle. Let's keep going. Yeah.
No, it seems like it's the feedback loop is sort of circular in that not only does an act of terrorism or something like that drum up the sort of support that allows for this hero narrative, but that also actions that are taken are done for the purpose of furthering that narrative and improving a politician's approval ratings. So I can see a lot of reasons why, in the event of the first terrorist attack since Trump's election, the action that he takes is a lot more determined by what he thinks his supporters would be most titillated by, etc. So in terms of messaging, how do you think is the best way
It's a great point.
That snowballing?
Yeah, it's a great point. How do you get out of a feedback loop like that? That's why I was sort of trying to get at. Are we as afraid of terrorism as our leaders think we are, or did we find ourselves trapped in this discourse, where fear of terrorism is some kind of badge that we wear? And how do we turn that, say fear shouldn't be the badge, courage should be the badge, right? So I don't know. That's why I'm trying to provoke this conversation, but I don't have an answer to that. Should we stop?
Well, shall we let Ben get off the hook? It was fascinating. Thank you so much.